All right. So we are now recording. So Arco Whip has generously volunteered to be our moderator for the first portion at least. So go ahead and tell us the prompt and maybe set up the discussion a little bit.
Well, I understand the prompt to be around this bimodal organization for society. Nietzsche is taking the position that a more collectivist organization is more moral than a more individualist organization, and Varsity is taking the more individualist approach. I believe there might be some aspect of one of them being more moral than the other. You two can hash that out. And I think because Nietzsche is taking the position that it's collectivist and was originally scheduled for this debate, why don't you go first?
Yes, thank you. So let's give my opening statement. So I'm going to give some background on the individualist versus collectivist argument. The person who originally I was supposed to debate, they're kind of the ones that frame this. I don't generally use the terms individualist or collectivist when I'm talking about these conceptions, but I think they work enough for us to like have a discussion about it. So by individualist, we generally mean society is organized around the principle that individuals have rights, and those rights cannot be violated, or their ability to pursue their own good cannot be curtailed in the name of some good that is beyond them. So, a collective good, as we would call it, right? And then the collectivist side says, no, a society needs a common good that they're all pursuing in order for a society to even function in the way that we consider societies to function. So the collectivist, which I'm going to be taking that side, would say that we cannot reduce the functions of a state or politics to a question of an individual right, because there are properties which emerge within a state that are more relevant than any individual's interest in the state. And Varsity, you're free to respond now.
Okay, well, so I wasn't aware that, I guess I misunderstood the prompt. I wasn't aware that there was going to be, we were talking about individualism and rights and things like that. So I'm not really sure what I'm supposed to be responding to.
Well, I mean, do you agree that do you think a state should be organized more around like individuals' pursuit of the good or a collective good?
I have no opinion on how the state should be organized.
You have no opinion.
Not really, no.
Can
I
you?
I guess I prepared for a different topic because I didn't read the. I only read the prompt that you messaged me, which was individualism versus collectivism or whatever.
Well, that's what we mean by them, right?
Well, I guess there's a lot of different debates we could have. I mean, there's the metaphysical one, which I would be even less interested in. And then there's more of like a pragmatic one, I guess, where it's like, irrespective of what we want to say about whether or not something that, whether or not this term individual actually has a referent in the world, like in other words, like whether or not individuals quote unquote exist. Obviously, that doesn't stop certain states from organizing around a more individual framework. Otherwise, we wouldn't have things like capitalism, right? Because that is going to be leaning either more heavily or maybe even you want to say exclusively towards an individualist framework rather than a collectivist one. So point being, like, whether or not whatever we want to say about what actually exists in the world, because that's a separate debate. For me, it would be a question of like which framework makes sense for analyzing problems, I guess, analyzing situations and problems that arise in society. Which doesn't make more sense to analyze a given situation in terms of the individuals taking part in it, or does it make more sense to analyze other conditions, like from a more collectivist standpoint?
Sure. I mean, I can speak to that question. So,
Okay.
I created a argument for why we ought to investigate these matters in terms of collectivism rather than individualism. So I can go through that and then you can respond to it maybe.
Okay.
So my argument is there's three possible ways that we could investigate the state. The first one is to fully explain the state in terms of individuals, right? So we would make no reference to any properties of the state in itself, but we only refer to properties that the individuals in the state have. And that would be give us an explanation that is not like contained within the state, but we can reduce it to the collective of individuals that are like comprising the state. The second way to explain the state would be to describe it as emerging from individuals, but not reducible to the individuals. So there's some properties that emerge when the individuals are working in a collective that arise in the state that no individuals have. And then the third way to view the state would to be completely autonomous from any individuals within it. So it would have its own properties, and the state would be kind of like ontologically above the individuals. So the state would exist, and none of the individuals' properties would really matter at all.
Okay. What
So
was the
before
first one again?
the first one was that we can fully explain the state in terms of individuals.
That would be opposed to the position you're taking, or is that part of it?
I'm going to take the second position. I'll give my argument in a second. I just want to like make
Oh,
sure.
okay. Sorry.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
So Arco posted it in the chat as well, if you would like to look.
Okay. I typed it up, but I'll take a look at that. That's probably better.
So while you're looking at that, would you like me to go ahead with my?
Yeah, please.
Okay. So I'm going to deny 3 that the state is completely autonomous, because I would say that the state is not explicable without reference to its individual components, right? Like it makes no sense to describe a state without describing like the needs of individuals. Maybe like their nutrition levels or their economic situations or their wants and dislikes with the political system. I feel like if you try to describe the state without the individuals, you would have a completely fruitless description. So I would deny 3, and that would leave us with 1 and 2.
Mm-hmm.
And then my second one that I would deny would be number 1, which, while it's appealing because it seems more elegant, right? To explain something in terms of something else is probably more likely a better explanation than if you explain it wholly in terms of itself. I think that it does have elegance and parsimony on the side, but it fails to explain properties that we refer to when we talk of states, right? So we talk about justice, equity, liberty, and virtuous action. But when we talk about individuals, these virtues, as we might call them, or maybe like prescriptive statements sometimes too, they don't make sense without referring to a collective of individuals. So we would have to almost deny these qualities, these ethical qualities, if we were going to explain the state fully in terms of the individuals. So I would say that leaves us with only 2, that there are emergent properties that a state contains that are not reducible to any individual's actions.
Okay. So one question. I think we would both be in agreement on 3. That's a topic that I know there's other authors, but the only authors that I'm aware of that I've read who have argued for something like, I guess, group agency would be Christian List and Philip Petit. I think I'm pronouncing that right. I've read some of their work on it. my position on that was probably going to be similar to yours. Maybe leaving open the possibility that I could be persuaded on that at some other point. But yeah, I guess to me, 3 is asking. It's asking a little bit too much from me. Like it's asking for too many metaphysical commitments that I don't feel prepared to make. So I think we're in agreement on 3 being set aside. And that cleans things up, which is nice. So
Mhm.
one question I was wondering when you were mentioning 2, when you said we can describe the state as emerging from individuals but not reducible to individuals because there are certain properties that when individuals are working together, none of those individuals have. Like, what would be some examples of that? Assuming that they're uh, different from the properties that or virtues that you ascribe to the state. I'm assuming that there would be something else.
Well, so I would say like justice, right? So individuals don't have justice um, in relation to themselves. Like there has to be more than one individual for them to have that property. So I would say that that arises when there's more than one human being. Um, Another example I would say is equity, because equity is like dealing with just distributions and access to things. And so it doesn't make sense when you have one individual that equity would be a property that we would speak of. And then my third one would be liberty, because liberty implies that there's a power relation between more than one individual. So I don't think liberty makes sense when talking about just a single individual. So I think these are all properties that arise once you have, I would say, at least 2 people, but maybe you might need even more. You might need a whole society for some of these.
Okay. Yeah, this is interesting. I think I would be in agreement with you on equity for sure. I can't at this moment imagine a situation in which saying an individual person has equity makes a whole lot of sense. Um, I guess before I go on, I would just want to get more clarity on like how, I mean, we don't want to get lost in the weeds here, but I guess roughly how would you define these other 2 terms, justice and liberty?
Sure. I think justice is in a society that has a common good, it is the just distributions of those good and everyone being fairly accommodated to their position in the society. So if
So
you have some sort of role in the society, you are performing that role and you have complete access to the role that you are the best suited for.
So, what I was going to ask is how would you distinguish justice from equity in that case? Because I guess what was throwing me off was defining justice as a distribution of some kind. Would you say that equity is more of a distribution of like material goods, whereas justice is a distribution of something more abstract?
I would say so, yes. I think equity is a distribution of material goods and justice is a distribution of I would almost say like social responsibility. Like in one sense, you're performing your responsibility, and the society is performing its responsibility towards you.
Um, I guess actually that's not so strange after all, because that would be, I mean, are you kind of, would you say that kind of aligns with the like the republic, like being used as a metaphor for the um different parts of the individual, like it with Plato and such?
I think that that could be an apt metaphor. I don't want to go
Mhm.
like, to me psychologically it might not bear out, but I think it works on a like experience level.
So you don't like the, I mean, so you're more amenable to the way that he talks about the way he carves up society, but not so sure about him taking that and applying it to individuals?
I am fine with how he defines justice. I think in I am not what I'm not fine with is making certain assumptions about how the mind works talked about in a that very abstract way that's not referenced to physical properties. So
Okay.
I don't know how useful it would be as like a psychological theory, but I think he captures like aspects of our minds that roughly correlate with these principles in society. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean we've definitely come a long way since, uh the time of Plato in terms of our understanding of the human minds, which isn't to say that we have all the answers yet, but we've definitely come up with other explanations that go well beyond this kind of I mean, I'm definitely skeptical of the intellectualism aspect, the idea that there's this sharp divide between well, there's sort of this assumption that when someone does something, it's they've thought it out rationally and decided this is the best thing. Is that something you're also skeptical of?
Yes. And I think here, and I might be able to put this slightly differently because, like, again, I'm going to defend position two out of the three that I presented. So I'm going to say that, like, if you go looking for justice in the individual's mind, you're not going to find it there because I don't think justice makes sense in terms of individuals.
Okay. So I
That
guess where
doesn't
I'm
mean that there might not be some universal quality of justice that we participate in, but it's not to say that you're going to find it within the individual's mind in some like psychological or subconscious like um modality.
okay. So I guess where I'm anticipating that there might be a problem, though I'm not totally sure yet. But what's coming up for me is that I guess I would be okay with handing over the term justice to you to apply to something collective rather than apply it to individuals, as long as we can come up with another word to account for something that I think is observable in humans, um, which I guess I'm struggling to come up with how to explain it to see if you would agree or disagree. But I guess there's something that I think that's observable within human beings, that we can have these moments where that involves, I guess, a little bit of self-reflection, which maybe that alone um, erects some sort of divide. I'm not sure, but that there are these moments of self-reflection combined with some process of conceptualization whereby I have some idea of who I want to be, and there's some disjunct between that and the way I'm acting or the way I'm about to act, maybe in certain cases. Um, I guess I would be fine with handing over that word justice to apply to, my fulfilling of some idea that I've thought about and feel like I have a good reason to strive towards in my life, just as a person, irrespective of whether or not other people see me doing it. I just think this is the right thing to do. And maybe I'm the only person who sees myself doing it, but that's just important to me. Um, I'm not sure if any of this is coming across, but would you agree that's something that does take place and that we would need some kind of word to use instead of justice for that?
Sure. Yeah, I would agree with that. In fact, I think generally existentialist philosophers deal with that. And I think that that arises partly because we, as individuals, we've been so displaced from our traditional role as members in a community that we now have these kind of existential questions because we are like untethered and lost from our original kind of species function, which was to exist in a political manner.
Okay. So, um, and feel free to put the brakes on me if this is jumping the gun a little bit, but would you argue for the idea that adopting a more collectivist framework for analyzing and possibly organizing society would actually rectify that problem that you just highlighted?
I would say almost definitionally, but here's my thing. I don't know that like my purpose for explaining it this way is to elucidate how the thing actually occurs or happens in real life. So I don't want to say that like if we just rectify this like misunderstanding about our relation to morality and to the state, that we are going to change our society. I think that would be like kind of a foolish thing to assert, right? I think that a lot of that it being rectified depends on us realizing, not only understanding but also realizing the misconception that we're having, right? So if we don't apply it to the society in some way, usually through political means, we're not going to rectify the situation.
Okay. I mean, we're speaking a little bit abstractly here, so it's possible that you may come up with some situations that might lead me to walk back what I'm about to say later. But that might be an area that we disagree on. And I think maybe that's why I said at the beginning that I, maybe a little bit cheekily, I'll admit, I have no opinion on what how the state is organized. Of course, I have certain preferences or certain things I would like to happen and not happen in my daily life that I don't believe just fall out of the sky. That I believe are, arise from the social and material conditions that I exist in and can't escape from. But I think where I guess one of the ways that I approach philosophy in general is I approach philosophy as something that I should be able to make use of regardless of what those material or social conditions happen to be. And if there's a philosophy that I feel like requires that certain conditions already be met in order for me to practice them, like if somebody were to say, if you want me to be a good person, first X, Y, and Z conditions have to be met. I mean, depending on what those are, I think in most things that I can imagine someone populating those variables with, I would say, well, no, that just doesn't sound like a very good ethical philosophy. Like I should be able to act ethically regardless of what the situation is. So like, and this is actually one of the things that I get irritated by when I'm talking to people that are critical of Marxism. Because that's one of my things is like, well, if the Marxists want to do a revolution and that's just what happens, I should be able to figure out a way to act ethically within that system just as much as I am in this one. Who knows? Maybe I'll be able to fulfill that desire to act ethically even better. I don't know. Never been in that situation before. But do you kind of get where I'm coming from in terms of like the way I approach philosophy as like this should be something I should be able to enact regardless of what the state happens to look like at the moment?
I think I agree with you, and it's not because I think that I don't think that it actually is a disagreement with the way that I'm viewing it. I actually think that what you're doing is kind of proving my point, because I
Okay.
agree that no individual action that you make is going to affect the overall like morality of the state or of the function of the society that we're in. So it seems to me that if you're going to propose that if we change our behavior in some way or change the way we view something, it's not going to change how moral or immoral you are. I think what you need to do, given to the way that I explained the state, it has emergent properties from individuals, that you have to change the way the state is functioning and our relations between each other in order to change the morality of the relationships between us, right? Because those are governed by the state and by the collective. So I agree, I would agree with you, but it's because I view that morality and political relations are a function of the state. So it doesn't make sense that just changing your individual behavior would be the thing that causes you to be moral or immoral.
Okay. Yeah. That makes sense. When you say that, I want to make sure that I'm getting this part right, because I feel like this is something where if I misword just one thing, I'm going to be totally off base. So just tell me if I'm getting this wrong. You're saying that morality and ethics arise from the state. Is that accurate? Or
I would say society. I don't know if you need a state per se, but like, yeah, for the most part, yeah, I would say that's correct.
okay, and that because of that, if we want to improve our moral and ethical condition, what we need to change is the society itself, given that that's where these things are arising from.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so my question when we get to that point is always this, and it might sound like a stupid question, and I would say there's maybe two prongs to it, and I'll give the probably stupider prong first, which would be assuming that the society currently is not in such a position from which these more ideal ethics or morals could emerge. And again, I guess I would also want to, at some point, maybe know what you have in mind specifically in terms of what things would improve from that first phase of we're changing society. If that's the case, if we're in sort of this compared to what it could be, this more depraved state, I guess, if you'll permit that term, that there's, I guess so the stupider question would be, how can I change my society if I don't already have access to those things, which I would have access to in this new society, which I would assume I would need in order to implement those very changes. And I kind of already know the answer, but I kind of want to hear it how you would put it, I guess.
Sure. Can you repeat the question one more time just so I can be very clear with what I'm saying?
Okay, yeah, maybe I can try and clean it up a little bit. So my assumption, so let's say I'm somebody who assumes that, okay, we've got to change society so that XYZ conditions can improve. But changing society dictates that I would have access already to an improved XYZ. And if that's the case, then how does someone in my position who's currently in this state of society where X, Y, and Z aren't being met, how do I avoid this problem of appealing to some kind of magical system where I just magically make things kind of appear out of nowhere, I guess might be one way to put it.
Sure. I mean, I think in some sense that we have access to prior models and history, and we can from education we can know what works and what doesn't. I think that's one part of the equation, and I think the other part of the equation is that we can intuit from our relations with people what are good and bad relations, right? So I think that what has happened is that we start to order society around I guess, and this is the socialist in me, but I would say like we order them around monetary and capital relations, right? Like we're concerned about the distributions of specific goods and maximizing that, and then the actual moral distribution and spreading of that wealth is kind of a secondary question. So to me, we've already gone wrong when we've organized society in that way. And we can kind of tell that historically because we know when there are vast disparities in the material outcomes of people, there is conflict and a lack of cohesion. And there's also disparate goods that we are trying to achieve because we're not going towards any collective good other than this maximization of wealth.
Okay. Um, So I think you and me have actually talked about this a little, at least once in the past. And I think something I'd asked you was something to the effect of whether or not you would agree that there are at least some relations that people engage with in a capitalist society, even that are not of this type that you've described. That, granted, we do in fact engage in these kind of like monetary capital relations, where we're organizing everything around that, and then secondary to that is the distribution of these goods. Let's say I agree with that. Would you agree that there are at least some relations that people engage with one another in that are not constrained by these, or would you take the position, as some do, and maybe not entirely without good reason, that quite literally every relationship, even for example romantic and familial relations, are themselves also constrained by this, like, capitalism infects everything basically kind of mindset?
I
Like, where
think
would you stand
capitalism,
on that?
yeah, I think it tends towards infecting everything. So I don't think it will ever perfectly get there. I mean, to some sense, we have an ability to block that out, right? And so if you don't let capitalism affect some aspect of your life, it's not going to affect your life. But for the most part, and this is just the nature of like I guess lowest common denominator, right? Capitalism always appeals to the lowest common denominator. So capitalism is going to infect the most amount of people that it can by exactly appealing to the most amount of people that it can and making a, I guess it would be like monopolization of these industries to the point where to even engage with what other people are doing, you have to participate in the system in some way. So it may be the case that you can slowly isolate yourself from others, but in doing so, you are like separating yourself from what it even means to communicate with other people by not engaging in capitalism. And I think that's how it like tacitly pulls you into the system, even if you were in some way not apt to join it.
Okay, yeah, that's good, because that last thing you said, I think, is a good limiter on like where I would, to whatever extent I would lean more heavily towards an individualist framing. That would be kind of the stopping point. I would not defend individualism in the sense of like the sort of, rugged Robinson Crusoe type individualism, like, you know, someone we know has argued for, of we're going to go off and form our own little community in the woods somewhere, to escape capitalism. But the first step of that is always we have to buy land. So, as Maximilian says, the first step of that is strangely doing capitalism. I would agree. I would not want to take it that far, because that actually, I think, defeats the purpose. Um, I guess where maybe I should have been more clear is that I guess I have in mind situations where I'm not talking about people actually isolating from one another, but relationships between people, which are not constrained, or at least not constrained to such a degree that we can't benefit from them or enjoy them, so long as, more broadly speaking, we're enclosed in a capitalist society. I guess that was more what I was thinking about. Like, not this idea that, not this question of like, oh, well, you agree that I can run off and do my own thing in the woods or whatever. Like, yeah, I could, but that's not what I would really be more interested in. I'm more interested in like the relationships that people can forge with one another, that aren't constrained to that degree by the other stuff that's going on in the society. Does that
Sure.
make sense?
Yeah, and I think what I described does not just apply to an individual like running off. I think it applies to even groups too, right? So like in some sense, we're on Discord right now speaking about these things in this forum because one, Discord is a capitalist entity and like this is the way that we are coming together to communicate this idea. But in another sense, it's like this kind of discussion is barred from mainstream discourse in some way, or there's some kind of limit to the access of it that has, I think, objectively speaking, over time, it's become harder and harder to be part of the public discourse without some kind of monetary relation overall, right? So then, like, it's upon us as individuals to form like smaller communities and kind of isolate ourselves from the greater community to even participate in the discussions that are happening.
Okay, that I would agree with, because even some of the examples I have in mind when I think about it do involve, yes, sort of sequestering away from the group, at least maybe not permanently, but at least like in the, you know, like one example that I bring up on here, I think enough would be like the 12-step movement, mutual support groups like that. Something that's not owned by any one particular person, but something that's facilitated and constructed basically on a daily basis by whoever happens to be participating in it. Even in a situation like that, yeah, the whole purpose of those groups' existences is to give these individuals at least an hour away from the rest of society, to organize around a shared problem and a shared solution. But I would agree that that would also be an example of splitting away, even if it's not permanent and even if it's not just one person. It is a group of people, whether it's 5, 10, or 20 or whatever the group happens to be. It's people organizing precisely because they are different in some way, in at least some respect. But what I would place on the other side of that scale would be that a group like that, or a religious group or something like that. And I wanted to use the 12-step rather than a religion because I think that like there's more. I think you have a stronger case in terms of like there's some sort of monetary element to that with the religious stuff. And there's much less of a sense of it being sort of co-created by the individuals, and obviously there's a lot more hierarchy stuff with religion, so that's why I'm not using that as an example. But taking like these mutual support groups, like even though there are these individuals that are sort of cloistering themselves for a certain amount of time, the activity and the discourse that goes on within that, ultimately, at least ideally, like doesn't always happen, but ideally is tending towards individuals then taking whatever benefit they get from participating in that group activity and bringing it with them back into the quote unquote regular world of everyday life. So I guess I would want to know what you think about, and maybe you have a better example than that, because I know that's a little bit of a very niche kind of thing. I'm not trying to bring that up just because it's an obscure topic, but I guess I would be interested how you feel about this idea of individuals coming together, sort of separated from the bigger picture, but then whatever activity they engage in amongst each other privately, perhaps, at least for the time being, they can then take and sort of inject into their other relations and possibly maybe even improve them. Maybe a better example would be, I guess, and I would have much less experience in this area, but I guess maybe a even better example would be like some sort of leftist organization, like setting aside an hour or two to meet outside of the work hours and discuss, hey, what are some better ways that we can design society so it doesn't suck so much? Like, though that activity of creating something and talking about these ideas, I mean, you would agree, right, that the goal of that organization is to then take those ideas out into the world and apply them practically. And I've gone on a bit much, so I'm going to pause and ask if I'm making any sense here.
Yeah, I mean, to me, what you're describing is building a new commonwealth or society. So, yes, I think that you can, as individuals, organize and create a new entity that has its own emergent properties. But again, you would fall back to the same issue that I described at the beginning, which is that you cannot reduce any of those properties that this new entity has to any individual within that. It only makes sense when talking about it as a cooperative venture.
Okay. So I guess, would you be able to explain why that means it makes more sense to organize society like along a collectivist line? Or whatever the prompt is that we're discussing, because I'm not sure where we're at now with that. I'm totally fine with it morphing into something different by the end. That's fine too.
Oh, I think that I mean that to me, if you want the goods in a society to emerge, they have to emerge collectively. Like you have to bring them about collectively because they are collective goods that you are talking about. So in your example of the leftist organization, like let's say in the US, which is where we're from, it would be
Yeah.
like maybe Democratic Socialist of America, right? We don't have like a real left organization, so that would be the first left that we can get. The point of that organizing that group is like we recognize that our society is flawed because in the principles of these collective properties, we are not meeting the ideal that we can envision. Like there's something off with it. Like in some way, we are separated from the ideal society that we can envision. So, as a collective, we're trying to bring about that society in a broader scale than what we're bringing it on in an individual scale, right? So, I would say it's incumbent upon you first to bring it about on your individual level, but two, bring it about on the societal level because you think that it is more worthy to pursue those goods than the goods that we are already pursuing within our society. Well, what are those goods in the capitalist society? It's generally pursuing the individual's good at the expense of any other good. And like we have a system designed around that, right? So like as long as you're pursuing your own good and not infringing upon others, you are able to pursue whatever good you want. But what happens is we tend to lose sight of these emergent properties of a society, such as justice, equity, liberty, etc., because of the fact that we are pursuing our own goods and we do not have those goods in sight as a collective. That would be my
Yeah.
argument in relation to what you're saying.
So yeah, I would agree that losing sight of, I'll just use the shorthand, the bigger picture, and by that I mean losing sight of an analytical framework in which we are applying more of a collectivist lens, which I would agree people probably tend towards. If they're going to leave out one of these, it's going to be the collectivist one, more often than not, I guess. I would agree that's a problem only because I guess I didn't really make it clear at the beginning, but I think I did. I did say like there are going to be certain situations where I think applying a collectivist framework is going to make more sense, is going to match reality better, is going to take into account certain things that are left out by just looking at something individually. But on the other hand, there's also situations where I'm going to say the same thing, but just vice versa. So I would agree that that is something that does happen where we lose sight of one or the other, and that's a problem. Just like it would be a problem if there's whatever framework someone uses, if it's leaving out relevant pieces of information, whatever that happens to be, that's going to be something that's going to be a problem.
Well, I think so. If I can interject real quick,
Yeah.
I think it's not just that that's an issue, but I think that viewing the state as a collection of individuals has, to me, two main things that specifically make it problematic, if I can give those to you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I would say that one, the idea that the state is a collection of transactions through individuals, that as long as they are just transactions in the sequence of events, the outcome is also just. I think that's problematic because I think that if we look at historically, we'll find that even though any given transaction within the sequence of events might be considered just, it can lead to unjust outcomes that we find in the distributions, right? So, for example, in America, we have rampant wealth disparity, right? And some of those we know started from unjust transactions, but there's also a lot of transactions that, like, let's say, from the time slavery ended to now, those transactions on the way that society governs just transactions were just, right? Like people bought property from other people. But when you look at it, you end up with disparate outcomes in the sense that, like, oh, these transactions were large businesses or property owners buying property at a lower price than what it was worth from vulnerable ex-slaves or immigrants or just people in, like, with property or medical or education debt, right? So you end up with an unjust outcome, even though within your society, those individual transactions were part of a just sequence of events. So I think that's one issue with individualism that you just cannot get past. And I think the other is that people as individuals, they will always overestimate the harms that they are done to them. And they will always punish more than what's proportional to other people. And they will always underestimate the plight of others. So when we're governing what's just from the sense of the individual, well, the individual does not have an unbiased sense of justice. This kind of perspective that we need in order to bring about justice in our society is only brought about from a perspective that is outside of the individual and above it in some way.
Okay. So I'm willing to give you one. I would push back on two. I mean, maybe it's just a case of, my tending towards the whole some not all type of stuff, but I think I would push back pretty confidently on this idea that we can say that individuals always underestimate, um or sorry, no, you said they always overestimate the harm done to them by others, right? Or do I have that backwards?
Yes, they will almost always, I would not say always, but I would say almost always, overestimate the harm done to them.
So I guess I just know people that are almost completely the opposite, where they almost never correctly estimate um, the harm done to them by others when they probably should. Unhealthy relationships, that sort of thing, where someone should be able to take into account, like, um, there is something being done to me that is wrong and is harmful to me, but because of whatever, I mean, we don't want to get into a whole psychological forest here, but I mean, there's plenty of people, I think we could say that it's almost the opposite. So I guess it's not the always part that I have a problem with. It's more that all individuals are in fact constituted the same way, or we don't even have to say it's their constitution. It could just be their experiences. Certain people's experiences are going to lead them towards more of a sense of where they've been wronged, and maybe some other people's experiences will lead them to a greater emphasis on, you know, they'll blame themselves for things that maybe aren't appropriate to blame themselves for. I mean, would you agree that that is a phenomenon that we do observe in people?
It is a phenomenon, and I actually think that lends to my point just fine. I would say that generally that tendency deals with your positionality in society. So, like, if you have more power in this society, you're probably more likely to overestimate the harms done to you. Whereas if you have less power, you're going to underestimate that. And that is because you have a sense of what is owed to you is less in general. But regardless, my point with that statement was to point out that, like, as individuals, we are not able to estimate, like, what our we are not able to understand what our what is owed to us within the society without some kind of further perspective and some kind of like fair system in place in order to adjudicate that.
Okay, so I must be confused here because it sounds like you're saying that it's not possible until we have this new framing of society already in place to even begin to estimate what we might be owed or what we might owe others.
I would say that because I think society gives rise to the qualities of justice, equity, liberty, virtue, etc. So yes, I would say that as your society tends more towards a well balanced and good society, you would have more of a sense of what is owed to you.
Right, but I mean, at any point you could step in and say, well, we're just individuals. We don't know what's correctly owed to us. So how, I guess I'm trying to understand how that can be true. And it's also true that at some point we will just know that we've developed further enough to the point where we can say, okay, I have a better understanding of what I'm owed and what I owe others. I guess when does that point of departure happen between where we are now and where you would like us to be going?
Well, I think once you are in a society or in a group, you're able to envision more potentialities within that society, right? Like it doesn't make sense that if you're an individual with no exposure to it, that you'll be able to have much vision with what it would be, right? Like we don't expect people at the beginning of history, Homer, whatever, to have like a very nuanced view of what society is. But once
No,
you
I don't think
have,
that's who I had in mind, though. I think I had in mind, I would assume the same kind of people you had in mind, people that are living in the society that we live in currently.
oh sure, yeah, but
Um,
I'm gonna make a parallel though because I think that
okay.
we're always kind of limited by the society that we live in, and our understanding of society is governed by the society that we live in. So you're going to be able to envision other societies once you're in one, but what those societies are going to be limited, I guess, by like your relation within your society. So I'm not expecting everyone to, I guess, have a perfect, clear conception of justice, but I would say that participating in justice is always going to be make you more or less apt to like gravitate towards it. So, given that, it's not the case that like individuals are all going to like spontaneously arrive at this idea of justice on their
Mhm.
own, just like I guess contemplating on the society. But what's going to happen is that some people are going to, understand it before others, just like any other realm of knowledge, right? There's scientists that understand natural properties before other people do. And it's not because they're like smart or anything, but they're the ones that are thinking on it and doing it. And so, of course, you're going to have people gradually gravitate towards those modes and towards that new structure of society. It may also be the case that society goes a different direction and you go away from those kind of properties, right? You might have a less just society because people are organizing it in that way and people are gravitating towards it. And there's so many factors that govern which way your society is ending. I'm not going to say that just because you have like a perfect conception of justice, that your society is going to bring it about, right? Because in my opinion, some of the best views of justice were like during some of the most totalitarian times of society. Now, I don't think that's actually problematic because I think that those would be the types of societies where you'd be most sensitive to understanding what justice is because you're experiencing the most injustice. Whereas when you're in a kind of ambiguous society where you're like it's hard to tell whether things are just or unjust, of course you're not going to develop radical new systems of justice because you're just not experiencing it on like a visceral level.
I think we may be arriving at a point where you and I definitely differ,
Mm-hmm.
and I think you maybe you sense it too. I think if I were to try and put it succinctly, um, and you feel free to give me your thoughts on it, would be that we disagree. I think in terms of the where new ideas come from in a person's mind. To what extent those ideas come from the conditions that are available to them in society, and the degree to which they arise from something which we might attribute more to being unique, I guess, to that person.
We may. I mean, to me, speaking of ideas in terms of like things arising from an individual doesn't make sense to me. So you might disagree on that, right? Because I think that for the most part, humans are sculpted and our ideas are generated by society, not vice versa. I do not think individuals shape society very much. I think there is some room for it, but like it's a very small factor.
Yeah, it's hard to put it into concrete terms, but my intuition would be to say the opposite. Um, uh, Not, and when I say the opposite, I mean just that not to say that there is absolutely no role that society plays in the shaping of a person's thinking, but that the weight that's displaced to each of those poles of the dialectic I would revert them. But there might be certain specific areas, certain specific dimensions of human life that I would be more sympathetic to the view you're advancing rather than the more individualist one. But then there might be other areas where I would have the hard time kind of grasping what you're trying to go for. For example, the thing that keeps coming up for me just in the last few minutes that we've been talking is this question of like, okay, but the whole problem is that we're enclosed in this society, and that's where our thinking is supposed to be coming from. To, allowing, and you allow for some little bit of room that an individual might play in that, but for the most part, okay, let's assume that's right. So for me, the question is always like, okay, but then what leg do I have to stand on then, or you or whoever is making the point for that matter? What leg do we have to stand on to say this society that we have now is no good, or this needs to be improved, or we should strive? Right now, we're striving for X or Y, but really, what we should be striving for is W or Z or whatever. What can I base that if I'm simultaneously trying to say that everything that is coming out of my mouth is itself a product of this supposedly deficient society that I'm enclosed in? Do you kind of get where I'm coming from on that?
Yeah, because I think the society, it has its ideals and then it has its realization, right? So even though the realization of that society might be defective, it does not mean that the ideas are defective. So I think that there are a lot of ideals in American society, in revolutionary France, in Soviet Russia, like all these societies that are they were not defective in any way. In fact, I would say they broadly overlapped in what they were going for. But what was the issue was the realization of those ideals. And so that I don't think is necessarily a counterpoint to what I'm saying, because I don't think the issue is that we can't bring about these ideas or good ideas of what a society would look like, a just society would look like. The issue is realizing those ideas. And I think that is more so a case of a problem of organization within the society. So even though we want to bring out these high ideals in the society, we have an organization that is fundamentally unjust. But what happens is we tend to use justice as a cover for those unjust distributions. So, for example, capitalism uses the idea of meritocracy, right? So it's a way of covering up injustices by saying, well, you deserve it. And another example of that would be primitive accumulation. That the accumulation and the distribution that we have now is exactly a product of some people being lazy and some people working hard and collecting things. And those people were better, they had better traits, they had better qualities that led them to that. I think all of that is individualist readings of disparity that are used as a cover to rationalize the unjust distributions in our society.
Okay, so I'm just based on your response. I'm thinking maybe I'm not being as clear as I could be. Let me take because I guess what I feel like I was bringing up, you know,
Mhm.
isn't really set aside by what you just said, because I could easily just replace some of the points where I said, oh, where does our thinking come from? Where do our ideas come from? With, okay, fine. It's not the ideas, it's the realization of that, right? But that I would lump that in under an idea. I would say, okay, where does this drive come from in certain individuals that's not present in others to enact these changes, to make these ideals realized, to realize them, to take the time and put in the energy to organize around these ideals. Let's say you and I agree on that the ideals can be fine, but they're just not actualized at this moment. I guess the question I'm really still trying to figure out is, given that we're all enclosed in the same society, with this same problem of these ideas are not being actualized, where does that drive come from in some people to say, hey, we've got to do something about this, and on top of that, to actually come up with a plan of how to do that? Um,
Sure. So I would say that because you're asking me kind of two separate questions. Where's the drive coming from, and where is the idea? Where are the ideas coming from? I think the ideas have been roughly static for most of history, and I think that they are kind of implicit in the idea of a state, right? So I think justice, what were my words? Justice, equality, liberty, virtue, like all these things are almost inherent in the state. I think what you're asking me is where do people get the drive and the motive and the, I guess, will
well, the
to.
valuing, like to evaluate the possibility of actualizing a given ideal as something that is a good thing to do. Like
Sure, yeah.
you know what I mean?
Well, it's understanding if a instance of justice actually is a legitimate instance of justice, or is it a like cover up or smokescreen or like propagandized version of justice, right?
Okay, well, I guess I was trying to bite my tongue here for a while because this question keeps coming up for me.
Mhm.
I think one of the first questions I asked you was how you would define justice, but now it kind of seems like there's a couple of different connotations of the word kind of floating around here, and I just want to make sure I'm understanding you right. Like, it sounds to me like justice just is what the society considers just, right? Going back to when you were talking about, like, if the transactions are considered just, but the outcomes aren't just, that in and of itself seems unjustified. So I guess I'm assuming
No,
you
I
have
think.
some other no, go ahead.
Oh, I think the. Sorry, I think the way that I described it would show that my idea of justice is outside of the society in itself, like the realization of the society, but it is contingent upon there being a society.
Okay, I think that's I mean, that's kind of where I was going to go. I assumed, yeah, that you have some other conception of justice. Um, would you feel it's appropriate to say that's real justice, and this whatever society says is just may or may not align with capital J justice or real justice?
Yeah.
Okay. How do you arrive at this conception of justice such that it is, in fact, this capital J justice, given that you, like me, and everyone else in here is enclosed in this system in which that real justice is not actualized?
Sure. I mean, I think what happens is that you experience justice and injustice, and you're able to understand through whatever faculty that may be that you are experiencing a just or unjust action towards you. And so,
But
as
how
with
can you
anything,
define it as such?
how can you define it as such? I don't know if you necessarily begin by defining it, right? Like, I think you experience it before you define it, like most knowledge.
Okay, I mean, this is kind of like, I mean, splitting hairs a little bit. say we have some experience, okay, on what basis am I defining this experience as an experience of justice or injustice if ostensibly I have not come into contact with that capital J real
Oh,
justice
well,
yet?
I think
And
you
if I
are coming
have,
in I
and if
think
I
you are coming
have,
in
but then if I have, then I guess that kind of brings me way back to square one, which is like, well, hold on a second. I thought we were saying there's something wrong with this society, but now you're saying that there are instances where we experience real justice. So now I'm a little more confused than I thought I was.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think any society is going to be so depraved that there's not legitimate instances of justice, right? Like, I don't think any. I mean, we can envision the worst society where there would be no justice, and the best society where there would be no injustice. But of course, in any society which would be realized, they would probably fall somewhere between that. Like, there's a broad spectrum, right? So
Okay.
the mere probability is that you're going to experience justice or injustice at some point in your life.
So, were you finished, or I don't want to interrupt you.
No, that's what I'm saying.
Okay, so a more direct question then. At what point would you say that a society needs to be changed? Like if we're agreeing that there might be instances of justice and injustice, presumably there is some point at which we'll say, okay, there's too much injustice, there's not enough justice. What does that point look like? And again, I still feel like this question is on the table. How do we know if we are in fact enclosed in this sort of epistemic problem wherein we were only able to really imagine in terms of what's available to us?
Sure. I'll deal with the easy question first,
Okay,
which is
cool.
the first
That's
one.
fine.
I think that, to me, that there always be differences in your pragmatic approach, right? Like, some societies, it will be easier to just tackle things on a policy level. Like, my society is overall just, but I see an unjust policy. We need to change that through the means. There will be other societies that have warped in some way. It might be intentional through, like, intentional design by the ruling powers, or it could be just a gradual, like, decline through of values over time, or it might be totally, like, misplace belief in one value over another value, right? But you might end up in a situation where your society has become something that is unjust from its foundations, and you might have to change those whole foundations. I'm not arguing that, like, there's going to be a point where you just overthrow the whole society. That may or may not be the case. I don't know. It really depends on your society. And I think one issue is that you're kind of viewing this as a, um, I guess, a black and white, in the sense that, like, you either have an unjust society that you're going to overthrow, or you have a just society that you accept. I don't view it that way. I think that justice and equity, liberty, all the things that I've been bringing up, they are things that you have to realize constantly. Like, it is an active participation by every member in the group believing in those things and acting upon those things and constantly bringing them about. So, given that, it would make sense that sometimes you will overthrow your government because you think that that government has become so corrupt that you're not promoting those virtues at all in any sense. And in the other cases, it's the case that, like, you just need to change your government because either some people have power in it that are not acting in your best interest, or there's some, like, institution that has uh, gone awry in some way. So I would say that, like, it's not the case that it's a black and white, and you're just gonna one day realize, oh, I'm in a unjust society. I need to overthrow the government. It's just something that you're constantly realizing.
Right. I think that's a fair point. I'm playing a little bit playing devil's advocate with that the black and white stuff. But I agree that's a fair objection to that. When you're saying that there might be a situation where you have to change the whole thing from the ground up, but that's not necessarily the case. I can see how that coheres a little bit more, I think, now than I did before. But I still am given to wondering at any given juncture that I find myself in, where I'm evaluating whether something is justice or injustice. I'll set aside that contention I've been bringing up for now and say, like, okay, it's possible for me to have a conception of justice and injustice and experience those things. That it's not this black and white thing. I guess the question for me is still open, because clearly some people do subscribe to the view that you must change it from the bottom up. So I guess I would ask how you would respond to those people. Like, why not just change things from the bottom up? Wouldn't that be more? I mean, that would make things more simple, right?
I mean, that might be the case. I'm not giving a prescription for like societal change right now. I'm just trying to make a claim about how we can analyze it. So to me, it would seem reductive to think that there isn't a one single solution. So this is why I would not call myself a Marxist, because I think there's no given progress through history that we're going to go through, right? So even though I might be partial to the socialist perspective, I don't think there's like a formula to bring that about. So I would be skeptical of anything that prescribes some kind of formula for a just society.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking too earlier. There's at least something else that would distinguish your view of things from Marx's, which is that, to me, it kind of sounds like what you're arguing for is kind of the sort of thing that he was criticizing in the so-called utopian socialists, like specifically this idea that, again, from Marx's point of view, whether this is actually an accurate picture of them or not, from his point of view, something he was critical of in them was this idea that society will be, if not reshaped completely, that these improvements to society, to use your terms, to make things more just, more equitable, more virtuous, etc., that this will be brought about by people who are somehow exempt or not as constrained by the same social envelopments that everyone else is constrained by. Like, you used the example of the scientists, which I guess didn't really cut it for me, just because it's still appealing to this idea of, like, well, there's just something about them. Well, on the one hand, it's not something about them like they're smarter than everyone. It's just that they're the ones who are thinking about these things. I guess I'm not sure how you can have one without the other, because anyone can think about things but not be equipped intellectually to make much of it. But
I
I'm
guess I'm
sympathetic to Marx's criticism of this idea that you have these people who are elevated above society, essentially, and they're the ones that are going to design things. And he says, no, because what basis can you have? How can you have a basis of, here's all my plans for society, but I'm also somehow already a little bit separated from it in a way? I mean, I
Well,
doubt
it's
you
not
would
so much
agree with
that they're
that, but I
separate.
mean,
Yeah, no, I think it's not so much that they're separate. I think this is more of like just division of labor, right? So like scientists are the ones making scientific discoveries because they are the ones like working in the science field. Like the average person is not doing that. They don't have the resources allocated to them. They're not spending the time studying it. And it's not to say that they're incapable of doing it. I would never say that. I would say the majority of people are capable of pursuing whatever study that they want to. I just think it's just like if you're going to look into something and spend most of your time doing it, you're just going to have more knowledge about that thing. And you're going to be able to give a more coherent analysis of it. Now, I'm not gonna
I
say that
agree.
I'm not a vanguardist necessarily. Like I don't think there's an elite cabal of like revolutionaries that should bring about like any given revolution. And I think it's probably more accurate to Marx, right? Like I don't think he was necessarily a vanguardist, but I do think that you're going to have theoreticians, right? Like people that think about this stuff more because they have the free time to do so. And I think that is necessarily a function of the society that we live in. And I think it's it is a just a consequence of how we do education now, is that some people are going to be more educated about some things and have more ability through connections and their positionality and their monetary resources to actually bring these things about.
Okay, I mean, but would you agree that we observe situations in which these resources, as access to these activities, might be available and someone just isn't interested in them?
Sure. I mean, I don't know if that this proves me though. I mean, I'm not saying that everyone has to. I'm not arguing for like a societal determinism. I just say that the extent of our vision is kind of circumscribed by the society that we live in.
But not to such an extent that it prevents us from imagining a better society, right?
Of course not. I mean, you don't need to. I think that given any social framework that you come up with and you live in, you're going to experience problems within that. And of course, you're going to expand your mind about the society. So, like when I'm younger, I had much more faith in the system that I lived in just because I had not experienced the extent of the injustices that that society could provide me, right? So as I get older, I have a more nuanced view of it, and my view of what the society could be expands because I put to question the propositions that the society has given me, and then I have opinions on those propositions, right? So I'm saying that like it's almost impossible for you to like go completely outside of your society. But what I'm not saying is that you cannot like question the things within your society, because those are exactly the things that you are going to question, because those are the things that you are going to experience.
That's a really good point, and I would definitely agree with that. I mean, I had like 30 examples, but I don't think it's necessary because I would be agreeing. I would be agreeing with you. I mean, Engels is one that comes to mind, right? He's exposed to the conditions of the English working class, so that's what he decides to write about. That's what he wants to take issue with. There's probably more contemporary examples we could come up with, but yeah, I would agree. I think that's a good point. And I really hate to do this, but it just, I can't get it out of my head. Is this this idea that you said at the beginning, that now I'm losing my train of thought because I'm trying to remember. I want to be careful about how I word something that you said a while ago. That had something to do with like kind of this theme of like where ideas come from, which I agree we kind of addressed that already. I guess it comes down to this question for me of like, all right, if the conditions of the society do not prevent us from imagining a better one and making improvements on it, then I guess it begs the question for me of why are we trying to make improvements to it, in like these more fundamental improvements to it in the first place? Like, is it possible that the society, I'm not saying that I agree with this, but just to play devil's advocate here, is it possible that we already exist in a society that allows for these kind of innovations to be made upon it as new information is made available, as we have new experiences and learn from them, etc.?
I would say no, and I would say this is more of an empirical question that I think I can be confident in saying that we have data on, because I know for a fact from polling that the majority of people want one thing and our society does not deliver on that thing, right? So like you can go and look at what people want in our society, any given policy, and those policies that are in the majority are almost never brought about. So we can say that like we do not live in a society where like our actual beliefs influence that society in any way.
So then, it kind of keeps waffling back between that question and this other one, then, which is then how is change possible? Because it sounds like this is precluding the possibility of change. Maybe it's just because I'm misunderstanding. Maybe it's just the way it's being worded. Maybe I'm misunderstanding it. But that it
Well, I don't
seems to
think
keep
it,
counting between these two
again,
problems.
I think you're asking for something that's not possible to give, right? So like there's so many factors that tell you whether you're going to change something or not, right? Like you can have a populace that all believes in the right idea, but there's a strong military presence that just blocks them from being able to do that. Like we see that all the time in like more like less wealthy countries. Like you might have a population that does not want what the government or the state is trying to give them, but they are blocked from that because they just don't have the power to bring that about. You have societies like America and maybe Europe where money and power and um, propaganda influence enough people in the right ways. Or I think China is kind of going along this route too, where it's like there's very sophisticated public polling um, apparatuses where like the government knows what they can use to get elected, and then they use that to push through certain policies at the expense of other policies that they do not want to see happen. And so it's a kind of a way of manipulating what people like are attuned to and getting about responses that might be counterintuitive to what the individuals in the society want. And I think overall, there's just like there's other factors like the education system and like what kind of people are you training and like how is your society organized around the collective goods and like what goods are at the forefront. Like I just think there's so many factors that like for you to ask me like how this change how is change possible, I think I would be as in just as much of a like predicament as the individualist would in explaining that.
Okay. Um, Maybe another question then would be that's a fair point. Maybe another question that would have been more appropriate would be going back to what you said about there might be a society where the majority of the people have this idea of what's right, but the society, the government, what have you, prevents that from being realized. I can imagine such a situation. Um, what gives somebody enough confidence, though, that they do in fact have the idea of like what is right? Because I mean, like anyone could come up and say that. I guess what worries me is that anybody could come up and say, well, the reason you think you have the right conception of what society ought to look like is because because you're just pulling from what's available to you in this society, but the whatever you want to call it, capital J justice, that's something totally different. But we don't have access to that because we're trapped in this what's the analogy? The iron
Cave.
cage or what, right?
Truman Show, something like that, Matrix.
Sort of, which I'm not sure. Yeah, I don't. My worry, Nietzsche, is always going to be like any kind of like commitment that I'm being asked to make epistemically that involves uh, basically saying, okay, I don't have access to this higher knowledge, but for some reason, some other person who's in the same predicament I am does have that higher knowledge, and there's
Well,
no actual explanation of why.
I don't think I made that claim though, because like I would
Okay.
say that it would be on the part of the person who does have access to that knowledge prior to you to be able to that deliver that knowledge to you. Like that is what makes that person good at that sorry, that's what makes that person like a good prophet of that knowledge. I guess prophet would be the word, or educator or whatever. Like, it is incumbent on them to spread that to other people in a way that is accessible to them. So like my claim isn't that
I would
like
agree with that.
my claim is that like just by the nature of how we divide labor and how like even knowledge resources are allocated, right? Like in any society, like knowledge is allocated in some way just as much as money is. Like,
Hmm.
given that there's going to be people that are more knowledgeable about these things than other people. And that's not to say like any individual might not be able to come across it. Like, I don't believe that, because there's always independent education methods. But what I am saying is that like it's just like a statistical actuality that like people are going to like some people are going to be more equipped to answer these questions than others, and it's incumbent upon them to spread that knowledge to people. But I'm not saying it's inaccessible to them.
Okay.
I'm just saying that like the medium in which it's going to be spread is going to be governed by the society. Like it's the language that we use is just going to be created by the society. I don't think there's any natural language or anything like that.
No, and I think from talking to you over the last few months, I've been leaning even more heavily than I think I already was to begin with, more towards that position that like the way we talk about things is, we who's the name of that author that has the illustration with the knowledge beam or whatever?
Oh, Vico.
Yeah, yeah, that like that guy. That I like that. I'm very sympathetic to that idea.
Okay. That's where my theoretical stuff comes from. So
Well, then either I'm not as sympathetic to it as I think I am, or maybe it's possible to be sympathetic to that, but also still arrive at a different conclusion. Because what I was going to say next was that to me, it sounds like in the example you gave of somebody who has access to this knowledge, which okay, we can agree that's a possibility. So that some people might have access to knowledge and maybe better or worse at more effective or less effective at communicating that with people. The educator must be educated, etc., all that good stuff. It goes back to kind of what I was saying before about people sort of being not entirely removed, but at least for a certain period of time, being sequestered with people doing some sort of activity and then taking that and sharing it basically like a boon in a way with others. But you pushed back on that by saying, well, I don't think society can be changed by individuals. But to me, it kind of sounds like that would be an instance of an individual not changing it by themselves of their own power with no help from anyone else, but that would be an instance where an individual seems to be kind of the difference maker, at least, if not the only contributing factor.
well, they might be the difference maker, but like they're not like kind of freewheeling bringing in like an outside idea into the foray that is not governed by the society, right? So like they like the example that you're giving me, I would say like yes, the individual might be the difference maker, but the individual is still trying to change an aspect of the state within the confines of what the state is, and even their research or their like understanding of it is most likely going to be governed by a body of knowledge that is like created within that society.
Right, but again, not to the extent that their conclusion that they derive therefrom is determined to be in line with the dictates of their society. Like you can come up with a conclusion that results in you saying, I'm going a different direction than what my
Yes.
society is. Right.
I mean, I would say that that is, yeah. I mean, those are the possibilities, right? Like you're going to be given a proposition, you're going to agree or disagree with it.
So in a situation where an individual is or would be the difference maker, wouldn't it make more sense then to analyze uh, that situation from an individualist framing rather than a collectivist one?
I would say no. I mean, I'm not. I guess it's difficult in the sense that, like, so the reason I picked two, right, is because I don't want to deny that there's individuals. This is why we rejected three at the beginning. Because I would
Mhm.
say, like, to say that the state is autonomous from any individual would be ridiculous to me. But what I don't want to say is that the individual can change things without reference to properties that the state that they are part of has, right? So like I don't want to come up with this like kind of myth of an autonomous individual who's like kind of beyond the bounds of nature and they like just insert a new idea like a Prometheus figure almost like they get fire from the gods and they give it to humans. Like I don't believe in that. Like that is my concern with like this individualist perspective.
Well, then I guess maybe I'm unclear about what your distinction is between individualism and collectivism. If you're,
Well, I said
uh,
it's number two. It's like individuals like are governed by properties that are part of their society, but they are not like the society is not autonomous from the individuals. Like the society is still composed of the individuals and they run them, but there are properties that emerge from the individuals that govern the individuals that are not necessarily found in any given individual. So I don't think it makes sense to talk about individuals like changing the society completely from the ground up because for that to happen, like they would have to be creating like a new property that the society doesn't have already and bringing it to the society, which I just don't think that individuals have the power to do. But what I don't want to say is that like the state is autonomous from the individuals and individuals have no power to change it in some way. It's just that like the barrier for changing that has to be more than just like I came up with a new idea and it spread.
no, I guess I mean, actually, okay, I'm not muted. Um, I had, I also would not be arguing for this mythical individual completely divorced from society either. That's not what I think individuals are to begin with, and it's not where I would like people to go. I don't want people to go and find their own little uh, unclaimed territory in the middle of, you know, New Hampshire or whatever the plan was, and set up their own little society. Um, like I don't think that's where they're coming from or where they should be going. But then in that case, it kind of is like, to me, maybe the issue is that this hard disjunct between holding an only a collectivist framework and only holding an individualist framework itself, maybe that is doesn't make much sense. Like I take a page
That's
out of Coco's book, maybe take a little bit of an issue with the prompt itself, just to an extent.
yeah. I mean, again, I don't. I said at the beginning, I don't think collectivism and individualism are the best ways to talk about it, which is why I go gravitate towards two. I think two is the best way of explain. Proposition two is the best way of explaining a society. Um, and I would call that more communitarian, which just means that like individuals work towards a collective good, and you need a collective good in order to make sense of like moral and political propositions. But that does not say that like a state acts autonomously or has like a community has properties that are like above and beyond the individuals, right? Like they're emergent from the individuals.
So the way that I would, kind of going back to what I was saying before about like I'm not arguing for like this mythical individual. When I think about an individual, maybe you don't want to say changing things, but participating in a meaningful way to change things, that I'll agree that what they're doing is essentially surveying what options are available and working to, I mean, maybe to use an oversimplistic analogy, deciding how they want to play the cards they're dealt. But each potential option you may have of how you want to play the cards you're dealt, um, comes down to the individual choosing to play it in that way. And so to me, it's always going to come down to that, to a very sliver of choice, not unconstrained choice that comes out of nowhere, sort of thing, but choice within the range of options that's available. And to me, it kind of sounds like I guess I'm not sure how your number two conceptualization of society does allow for that sliver of freedom, or whatever you want to call it, that choice within a range of available options. I guess I'm not sure how it. On the one hand, I'm not sure how it allows for it, and then on the other hand, I'm kind of confused about how it's distinct from it, because I feel like it needs to kind of do both.
Mm. Well, I
You know what
mean,
I'm saying?
we've gone for an hour and 40 minutes, so I think I
Oh
might be
yeah.
coming to the end, and I think we are reaching maybe an impasse too, because I
Mm-hmm.
think like what you're asking me is almost like more of a view of like free will or something like that, or like
Oh, I don't want to go into. I'm not.
yeah. So that's what I'm wondering, like, or maybe like a theory of ethics that I wasn't prepared to do. So I think
No, no,
like
no. I guess what I'm asking for is what you've given me your sketch of society. I think maybe what I'm looking for is your sketch of the individual. Or do you think that by defining society in this way, you are defining the individual?
well, I think I'm trying to define the relation between the individual and the society, and I think the relation is exactly that. Like the society kind of governs our relations and our patterns of thought and our ability to express ourselves. But that does not mean that we as individuals are able to like work within that and change that and add to that. And like we're not, we're just circumscribed by that, but we're not like limited by that completely. Like we are that it gives us maybe our outer limits, but like within that, we're able to expand that. And I would even say that we're able to expand those limits, but we're not able to like just transcend them.
Okay. I agree. We've been going for a while. Do you mind if I ask you one last question?
Yeah, and I want to give a quote from Cicero before I left too.
Ooh, okay. Cool, cool. Um, let's imagine that you have actually convinced me of everything you've been trying to convince me. Now I'm a collectivist, or whatever you want to phrase it. I'm in line with number two, describing society as emerging from individuals but not reducible to them, etc. What is the first course of action you recommend that I take as soon as we get off of this call?
I would say go work for a union, a political organization, a like join a community and just try to bring about the change that you envision your society to do. And also, I mean, I think you already do some of the things that I would recommend from my perspective, which is like try to advocate for public education and refining the ideas in your society so that we're not kind of like governed by like different ideas of what things are, but rather we're trying to come to a more consensus based, knowledge based understanding of things around a common conception of what things are.
Hmm. That's interesting. Interesting point that you would say that at least some of the things I'm engaged with on a somewhat regular basis, I guess, could always be doing more, but that it's would fall under that
And I think
umbrella.
my original argument was going to be against Garrett, who's an anarchist, right? And I had a whole thing
I'm
prepared
sorry, I
to.
wasn't a good advocate for the anarcho-capitalist one because I don't agree with anarcho-capitalism. So,
No. But I think this was cool because I wanted to discuss individual and collectivism in like a more nuanced way. But like my argument was going to be like basically I'm going to get him to accept that the state has all these minimal conditions, then read him an anthropological description of a state from this pretty famous anthropologist, and then he's going to be like, he's going to have accepted all the preconditions for a state without there being a state, and he's going to like realize that a state arises from all the preconditions that he accepts.
which anthropologist was it going to be?
I don't. It's just some guy that I read in this philosophy book. Honestly, I don't remember
Oh,
his name. It's some like 20s anthropologist. But um,
I mean, I had fun. I hope you had fun too.
yeah, I did. I'll read my Cicero quote though, because this is what I
Yeah.
do know. This is what I do know about. I don't know about anthropology. In the case of music for strings or wind, and in vocal music, there is a certain harmony to be kept between the different parts. And if this is altered or disorganized, the cultivated ear finds it intolerable. And the united efforts of dissimilar voices are blended into harmony by the exercise of restraint. In the same way, a community of different classes, high, low, and middle, unites, like the varying sounds of music, to form a harmony of very different parts through the exercise of rational restraint. And what is called harmony in music answers to concord in a community, and is the best and closest bond of a security in a country, and this cannot possibly exist without justice. So that's my quote. And before someone tries to say I'm a fascist, I don't think that we need concordance between the classes. I just think we need unity between people. So there.
I like unity between people as well. I think that's a good thing.
Okay.
But
So good. I guess if anyone else wants to jump in and talk, we can do that for a little bit. But I'm gonna end this in 10 minutes.
okay, cool. Yeah, thanks for letting me fill in for Garrett.
Yeah, no problem.